Well, hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Julia Burnell, and I am with the Truman Center for National Policy and our sister organization, the Truman National Security Project. And together as an organization, we are a national membership organization with about 2,000 members all across the United States who are globally minded thought leaders and practitioners of progressive foreign policy and national security. And for the past about 5 or 6 years, an area of focus of ours has been climate change and the environment, and the way that climate and environment are really tied to national security, and both national security and also human security, community resilience. So we approach this from multiple different levels. And about a year ago, our local chapter here with Kendall and Stephen held an event here at the Alliance Center where they really drew out the connections between climate and national security. And we're back here today to talk about climate and community resilience. So with that, I will turn it over to Kendall and our panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks to the Alliance Center for hosting us for this. Climate change is the word we use to describe changing regional climatic conditions linked to a global increase in average temperature driven by an increased use in fossil fuels, evident since about the mid-20th century. It's worth defining it because it's a word that's bandied about a lot, and it's a word that's debated when you're talking to climatologists versus meteorologists. And when we talk about climate change, management comes in sort of 3 different forms. There's mitigation, which is what you do to try to prevent more climate change in the future. There is adaptation, which is how to live in a world that's already changing, and there is resilience. And resilience is what we want to talk about today because it refers to our ability to continue living and interacting with nature as it changes in real time in front of us. As Julia said, my name is Kendall Salcido. I'm not a climate expert. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit that works on business and human rights, and I'm the co-chair of the Colorado chapter of the Truman National Security Project, introduced by Julia. And I'm just very, very lucky that my work with Truman puts me in touch with some real cutting-edge leading experts in the field of local, regional, and national policy and resilience experts. And this esteemed panelist before you, who I'll introduce in just a second, are experts on mitigation and adaptation and resilience, and they understand the interconnections in ways that truly all of us need to. And it's a matter of survival, not just because disasters are becoming more frequent and more intense, but also because preparation for a changing climate isn't a matter of personal decision making. You know, it is important that we all recycle and carpool and reduce our own personal footprints. But the instability that disasters cause jeopardize global security. And this was the subject of our panel last year, focused on the global implications of climate change and political instability and violence and refugee crises. But today, we need to also talk about the way that communities themselves are interreliant, and we need to understand the different vulnerabilities and resiliencies within them. So, I have next to me 3 just tremendous Colorado speakers. Dave Anderson is the program director and chief scientist at the Colorado National Heritage Program through the Colorado State University in Fort Collins. His team has produced climate change vulnerability assessments, analyzing potential impacts on Colorado's species and ecosystems. I'm just going to plug it for a second. It's 573 pages, which is a lot of pages, but it goes through the individual land and water-based ecosystems in Colorado and individual species to assess the way that their reliant on current conditions and what it will mean when the conditions change. Katie Arrington is at the other end. She arrived in Boulder after the 2013 Colorado floods to serve as a flood recovery coordinator, and now serves as a resilience and recovery specialist for the county. And she comes to climate resilience from a public health background with a master's in public health in emergency community health and preparedness from California, which also knows climate change. And we have Andrew Notbaum in between the two, who is emergency management coordinator with the Boulder Office of Emergency Management. And he has also served as a wildfire mitigation specialist in both the public and private sector. And he has created and educated communities about healthy forests and how they can be defended against fires. And we're gonna talk for a limited number of questions, and then I'll open it up to your questions. But I thought we would start the discussion at sort of a high level, looking at our understanding of the ecosystem generally before we can drill down to what it actually means for us. Dave, in the climate vulnerability assessment that your team did across Colorado, one finding was that 5 out of 16 land-based ecosystems, and all but one of our water ecosystems, were highly or very highly vulnerable to climate change, and that they currently have low to moderate resilience. What are the conditions that are threatening those ecosystems?
Thanks for that question. And so there's a lot of different factors.
That mic is not on. Why don't you just switch?
Okay, thank you. So certainly temperature, drought, and very importantly, variability of those, and unpredictability of those are huge challenges for managers and for people who are trying to make livelihoods in Colorado, and for all of us who depend on ecosystem services from those systems, are all factors that led to that result. And for the work that we do, we're looking at resilience maybe through a little bit different lens than communities do. We're trying to understand how to manage systems in ways that allow them to change, because they all need to change, but yet still retaining ecosystem functions that hold the whole system together and still deliver the ecosystems, the benefits from nature that we depend on. And being here on the Front Range, we all need to be acutely aware of those benefits, because we're in a big city, and we depend on watersheds that aren't even on this side of the Rockies to provide us things that we need.
So are we looking at floods, at fires, at insect infestations? What are the phenomena that we're facing?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good.
And the transformation of these systems into novel systems that we don't even know what is going to be here yet, but looking at climate projections this century, the climate in Denver is going to be more like that of Roswell, New Mexico before long. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that all the plants and animals that live in Roswell, New Mexico are going to be here, because they can't get here very easily. And historically, these kind of climate changes have happened before. We've had much warmer climates in the past, but it's happened over thousands and thousands of years, so these species and systems were able to move across the landscape slowly and kind of respond to that change. Now, the systems that we have on the ground are going to become highly unstable. We were already seeing that. Fires, changes in winter temperature leading to these beetle outbreaks. So, and who knows what other thresholds we just haven't even quite got to yet. So there's undoubtedly more surprises coming.
Now, you've talked a lot about drought, the future of Denver as Roswell, New Mexico. What has brought some of the real attention on the issue here in Colorado is actually a flood, though. And your report found that while a lot of our ecosystems are facing drought, our big mountain rivers are facing flood conditions. And Andrew, I feel like you might have an explanation on why that's changing.
Why well, we were having a conversation earlier and just talking about some of the rain events that have happened historically in Colorado. And just a couple observations is, there's the Cherry Creek flood, there's the Big Thompson flood, there are these huge historical floods. And historically, the floods that we've seen around here in Colorado have been convective events with rainfall. And 2013 was very different. This was a low-pressure system caused by Gulf moisture that came up and parked on Boulder County for 2 days. For 2 days, nonstop rain. Very much was tropical-type moisture, saturated soils, and affected every major drainage within Boulder County, which is El Dorado Canyon, Clear Creek, Boulder Canyon, 4 Mile Canyon, Left Hand Canyon, James Canyon in the north and south St. Frame. That community is completely isolated, and at that time, it was the largest evacuation on U.S. soil post-Katrina, where over 2,000 people were evacuated by helicopter, and this is just 30 miles north of here. Being from Boulder County, one of our jokes is, best thing about Boulder County is it's only 30 minutes from Colorado. And people like to give us in Boulder a hard time, but it was a very different type of system and event than we've seen historically. And so I think that was part of the point of what we were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Katie, when we talk about the flooding of the St. Vrain and Left Hand and every river system in that region, you came out here to respond to that. What were the human implications for that flood?
So after the 2013 flooding, we found a lot of the most vulnerable communities in our county were highly impacted by the floods. We had at least 3 mobile home communities completely wiped out. And some of those mobile home communities actually had the land wiped out, so they weren't even able to rebuild, and then there was not space given back to those communities later. And a lot of federal reimbursement programs struggle with replacing temporary housing, which they consider mobile homes to be. So that was a huge struggle for our lower income communities, which in Boulder County are the primarily Spanish-speaking communities and the communities of color. It was highly impactful. We had a lot of those communities move away.
Katie, why does the federal system struggle to compensate those?
Federal programming to be equal and fair, federal reimbursement programming like CDBG-DR funds and FEMA, they reimburse for the value of what was lost. You can't build back better than what you were lost. So if you lost a $100,000 house, the amount you could be eligible, this is very simple terms, the amount you could be eligible for is $100,000. Mobile homes are not replaceable at the values that, a mobile home is $20,000 the value, but you can't get another mobile home for $20,000.
It's a depreciated asset.
Yeah, it's a totally depreciated asset. There's no way to rebuild it. The used mobile home market is full of terrible shaped mobile homes. So federal programming came around and we were able to have a mobile home replacement programming, but there was a delay.
And what happens to people while there's a delay?
They leave, they face medical crisis, they're living in mobile homes contaminated with black mold. So I think, our federal partners were doing the best they could given the parameters that govern the money, and we got there and then there was a year delay. So we lost community members, we lost trust.
Now, Boulder had a fairly innovative model. It had a community, I don't remember what it was called, but it's sort of like a community resilience organization. Yes. would you be willing to talk about sort of the strengths of that and what maybe would need to be changed in the future?
So Boulder County had a group called Boco Strong, which came out of the floods, which was developed from the Boulder Flood Relief Program, and Boulder Flood Relief was where all the donor funds to Boulder County came. So not FEMA funds, but like people that just wanted to individually donate money that they didn't want to donate to the Red Cross, and that fund had about $3 million. And Boco Strong, as that fund dwindled, we noticed there was a gap in community engagement and community resilience and programming that could be done around making communities stronger and building social capital. So Boco Strong was a loose organization with a bunch of different government partners and nonprofit agencies that existed until last year to do social capital building, community engagement, and other issues surrounding resilience. And Andrew sat on that committee too, so he can add.
Just one comment. I think that, the world, what I do is emergency management, but really emergencies, it's not a very good, I don't think it fits what I do, is that emergencies are day-to-day, they happen all the time in the city of Denver and Boulder. And what emergency management does is disaster management. It helps with when there are large-scale disasters where the community is affected and there needs to be consequences that are managed. And in general, I think nationally, we've failed as far as preparedness, and we haven't moved the needle nationally with community-type preparedness programs. There are a lot of studies and research out there that shows that. For government and response, we've done fairly well. We've built response capabilities and have more apparatus and resources, but our community and what those needs are, it hasn't been very good because we've had this top-down approach to preparedness. And so what we've tried to do with groups like Boco Strong and with the community is go bottom up and more sort of a resiliency focus on it, of what are the needs of the community and looking at the social vulnerabilities, what are our local cultures and geographies and languages and community groups, and building partnerships with those groups to build trust when there is a disaster so that we can meet their specific needs instead of this top-down, here's what you need to do to better prepare for the next disaster.
Why do you need to think about languages?
Well, just any sort of barrier to getting information out there. In my world, one of the things that a limitation, and I think that this is generally throughout the country, is that there are limitations in warning, simple things of getting information for public notification and warning. And so you need to diversify in the number of ways you get messaging to people if there's a disaster or relief. We had a call center during Boulder, and we had over 2,000 calls into this call center, and not one came in from a Spanish speaker. And we know that was not because there were not Spanish speakers in our community that needed help. We know that there were, but the system failed. And so part of what we're trying to do is address that with our messaging. We had a fire just 3 years ago where we had members in our community, and we heard this through neighborhood groups when the police went to do notifications in the city of Boulder, came to the door yelling policia, that they did not answer. And again, this was a moment of us going, okay, we need to change our messaging. And I think part of where we've had success is trying to understand and acknowledge where our gaps are. And we were at a conference recently, and it was called Getting It Right, and I was very uncomfortable with the conference called Getting It Right, because I'm not sure we get it right, but trying to get it right was a better way of approaching it. And so I think that we have that culture in our organizations of trying to get it right.
Now, there are two elements that you talked about right at the start. One was sort of the infrastructural, technical resiliency piece of it, and the other is the social resiliency. And I want to come back to social a lot, but on the technical resiliency piece, it's my understanding that one of the challenges that we face is what I saw in reports referred to as infrastructure redundancy, where if we lose one piece of infrastructure, that it disables us from fixing another. Can you guys, any of you, talk about an example of where you've seen that in action?
it makes me think of what happened in the flood after the Hyde Park fire in Fort Collins, where half of our water comes from the Poudre River and the other half comes from transbasin movement of water into Horsetooth Reservoir. And so when the flood happened and all of the hydrophobic ash that was still on the ground from the Hyde Park fire in 2012 came down into the river and turned the river black, which took out the water treatment abilities on the Poudre River, we were able to switch over to Horsetooth Reservoir and rely on that water supply. So having those two systems in place really saved our community after that happened.
I did not expect that example, and I love it because it brings me to another question I wanted to ask about. In the vulnerability study that your group wrote, they found that river flows were likely to increase in the mountain rivers like flooded Boulder, but that it was likely to decrease in the small small streams in the mountains because of ash blockages. And that was just sort of staggering to me, that we're ready for wildfires that are going to affect the flow of our rivers. And I wondered if any of you wanted to speak to how that will change animal, plant, or human activities.
Well, it's going to have profound effects on working lands. And that's something we've been working on with the Gunnison Basin Working Group extensively in partnership with TNC, Nature Conservancy, to help look at the social science side of the impacts of climate and the livelihoods of people who depend on ranching or being able to farming and ranching, and the importance of the dependability of water resources there. So that work is focused on the restoration of headwater wetlands, which get at some of this problem that we're coming up against, because when the headwater wetlands become degraded, the water table gets separated from the surface of the ground, where you have mesophorbs that things like sage-grouse depend on for rearing their broods. When you lose that connection of the water table to the surface, and the water table goes down, you lose the wetland, the obligate or facultative wetland plants that are in those sites, and you also lose the sponge as you start to have head-cut erosion through these wetlands. And those sponges at the very tops of these watersheds are what keep the rivers flowing later in the year. That's going to become even more and more important as we dive deeper into changing climate, because as the winters warm, more of the precipitation is going to come down as rain instead of snow. So the snow that, as it melts off, keeps the rivers flowing longer, won't be there. And so we can expect watersheds to dry up sooner, which is an enormous threat to all human enterprise.
Now, before we get too dark, your group is also working on. But wait, there's a silver lining. Your group is working on improving wetland conditions, which is having spillover effects to improve farmlands.
Oh my God, this is my favorite project to talk about, because it's so exciting and inspiring. We've actually, through this working group, come upon a way to really adapt to climate change in ways that, restoring these wetlands, those are the best places to graze in sagebrush shrublands. And so we're restoring the ability for livelihoods. And it's a really wonderful community effort, because landowners and land managers and agency people, conservation groups are all working together. And I was talking with the BLM person who was working up there helping to restore some of these headwater wetlands. And she was talking about how it just didn't really matter where the property boundaries were. Like, everybody was working on it together, so it was the whole watershed that was coming together. And the way that they're doing this is really cool. It's these things called Z-dike structures. The methods were developed by a guy named Bill Zedike, who's getting close to 90 years old. He lives in New Mexico, and he's this amazing, inspiring person who has figured out these super simple ways to break the energy of the water and slow down the flow, the speed and energy of the water on the landscape so that it doesn't cut down and take away soil.
I was picturing Z dikes, but it's
Yeah. They all have cute little names like Zuni bowls and stuff, and they're made with one layer of rock. And you do this. It's done with a great deal of planning and thought, so that you intercept the flows of water on the surface and break them up and keep the water on the surface where it needs to be. And we've been monitoring these since the group started in 2012, and have seen a tremendous resurgence of the wetland plants that are supposed to be there. And we've seen these head cuts, the erosion stopping. And so not only does that help conserve human livelihoods, it's also going to save the Gunnison sage-grouse, because they have to rear their broods in these headwater wetlands. And that species is in a state of rapid decline, but this is bringing back the key habitats that they need. And the people who, folks who live in Phoenix are going to like this project as much as we do, because these sponges that are getting reestablished in these headwaters are what are going to keep the Colorado River flowing for longer.
I feel like these are the kinds of inspiring stories that we need, that bring together human ingenuity and a commitment to the environment and to livelihoods and to neighbors. I also get the sense that climate discussions can sort of get split between the urban and the rural, and I wondered if maybe Katie or Andrew, you wanted to talk about sort of a community building that has come of a disaster, sort of a silver lining, or a rebuilding that's working in your communities.
Yeah, so, one of the things it's a great question, and one of the things in sort of, switching up our resiliency programming and more of a strategy of how we do engagement is developing, it's a program where we've called the cultural brokers. And, I'm a proud mountain resident in Boulder County, and, my neighbors are very different than Katie's neighbors in Lafayette, but we have similar concerns and are concerned about disasters and what we do. And so in this cultural brokering program, we're again looking at those community groups and common cultures. It can be geography, or it can be social groups, and really trying to develop relationships there and understanding what the needs are, because it is a different conversation in unincorporated Boulder County than it is in the city of Boulder. And we're a joint city and county office, my office is, and how we talk to community members in different parts of the community, it really depends on your audience and knowing your audience and building trust and understanding with them, and try to seek a deeper understanding. And so this is one of the things for myself. I work under a board, which is the sheriff for Boulder County and the police and fire chief. And in the first response community, it's a very different conversation with this traditional sort of law enforcement group. And so I've have self-named a job title for myself. I am the cultural broker for, or I'm the human dimensions coordinator and the cultural broker for climate adaptation and equity. And what does that mean? It means when there's a request to come and talk to a group like this, Andrew goes, or when there's a time where we need to be represented at the sheriff's office, and somebody needs to come in and have a hard conversation about the human dimensions related to disaster, and not just stopping the bad guy or putting the fire out, that there are long-term consequences. I'm the person that plays that role within our department. And it's a very important department, and I feel like part of my role is in the state and within regional government too, providing that sort of perspective and background to groups that are traditionally thinking of disasters and resilience as putting it out or stopping it, and then it's done. And the human dimensions go on. Recovery of our disasters is still going on in Boulder County for the 2013 flood. It's still going on in my neighborhood of the 2010 4 Mile fire. And so, that it's a long period of time, and we need to be engaged with our community and understand our community and have trust in our community so we can help better address what those needs are.
A really specific example of seeing build back better after disasters is after the 2010 Fort Mile fire. In the mountain communities, they developed a group called the Intermountain Alliance, or IMA, and the IMA has membership from all of the mountain communities, and that group has a direct link to the Emergency Management Office and my elected officials office to get issues of mountain-specific issues addressed. Not properly plowed roads, not enough housing, and they developed and became a stronger community after the 4 Mile fire, and because of that, they were a stronger community in the 2013 floods. When they had connections that they wouldn't have otherwise had, they were able to save houses with big equipments, and knowing who had the big equipments, they had a ham radio network set up that they didn't previously have to connect neighbors and let it know about evacuations. And I really believe it saved lives in that instance. So they built back strong. They built that stronger immediately, and it was tested immediately. And that group is still growing on strong, even despite not having a disaster that they're kind of gathering behind right now.
I have lots more questions, but I wanted to take a break from me and just check out the room to see if anyone back there wants to weigh in just yet.
Can we talk a little bit about an air event? So a fire in one location and an inversion and polluting the whole front range, something like that. Do you guys work on that at all, or are you prepared for something like that?
That's me?
No.
We're
both looking at you.
So the definitely a concern, public health, and CDPHE, the state public health, would put together an air quality warning. That's what we're talking about.
Sure.
There's definitely a concern, and we've seen that with inversion on the Front Range and some of these large wildfires that we've seen in southern Colorado and northern Colorado. And so air quality is always a concern. The response piece to me of how that works is that, generally an emergency operations center is set up that helps coordinate these consequence management pieces. And so there would be a connection to the state of Colorado looking at that and then putting out recommendations or warnings and for children or elderly, but it's another health risk that is secondary to sort of the immediate evacuation and get out and life safety, but is also life safety type issue.
On those secondary impacts, I actually had a question too. After the 2013 flood, the floodwaters went out onto the plains and affected an array of oil and gas operations. The immediate relief phase after that was to shut down the wells and to a sewage treatment plant was affected, so get the E. coli out of the water. Is anybody monitoring sort of the long-term secondary effects of that on the ecosystem, on climate resiliency, terrestrial resiliency?
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that, disasters and big disasters like that, they start and end locally. And so sort of local monitoring and regulation, we're a home rule state, and so what goes on in Boulder County or Jeffco County or Denver or Weld County are very different, and it's up to local regulations and then the state board sort of monitoring that. But there's a lot of room for things to get lost depending on local capabilities. We're very lucky in Boulder that we've had, and it's not lucky, but we've had multiple disasters. There's buy-in from our policy group and an understanding that it's not a matter of if, it is when we are going to see these sort of events. And so we have strong policy group, but some more rural communities don't have the engagement or don't have the funding or backing to monitor things as well as we do in some of our front range communities with larger populations.
I was going to say that after a flood, there's also other secondary impacts, large amounts of debris, large amounts of mud, And typically, local government doesn't remove debris from private property. They don't help homeowners with that, but the amount of debris on private property in the flood was so tremendous that another flood would have created major infrastructure problems with bridges and everything downstream. So Boulder County, after the flood, had a debris removal program evaluating infrastructure risk and kind of long-term debris removal. And that's where a lot of kind of the pop-up response organizations came to do the mud clean out of the homes that a lot of the federal and local agencies don't usually participate in.
So that's just one of those clear cases where community resilience is going to be a community-driven process. And I like that example too, because I think there's a sense that that climate victims are the poorest and most vulnerable and marginalized, and there is sometimes an inclination to safeguard yourself, to have your gallons of water in your basement and to have your microgrid or your generator. But that's the kind of issue where you can't make yourself resilient against debris running through your property or through your house. Another thing that go ahead.
I wonder where firefighting fits into this, because I had a chat with Colorado's supreme overlord for Forest Service, and he basically said we used to spend like 8% of our budget on fire, and now it's 45%, and that was a couple of years ago. It might have gone up. And he advocated at the time that those budgets need to be completely separated so Forest Service can still do what it was installed to do. And that wasn't fighting fires, that was just one segment.
Yeah, I can comment just briefly on that. And the Forest Service, I mean, it's natural resource protection is ultimately part of their goal, and they do at these big fire years as a national agency put most of their budget into fire suppression. And I would just say too that there, some of the fires we've seen, I mean, what you see in California, what some of the extreme fires we've seen around here from Waldo and Hyde Park, there are certain fires you can't really fight with what they call direct tactics, right? You're waiting around for weather to change so you can use sort of suppression tactics on them. And so these extreme fire events, it is until the weather changes. There's not really much strategically you can do to help put it out when you've got low relative humidity, high temperatures, strong winds, and dry fuels. And when it's in topography or remote areas, it is really hard to go and be, direct in your tactics to fight those fires.
Now, are we redefining what a healthy forest looks like as our forest climate changes?
I think we need to examine that, because our traditional models of management of trying to keep things, restoring forests or managing forests so that they look a certain way because that's how they've always looked, is not going to necessarily work anymore. And we've done a lot of modeling of where the climate envelopes are going to exist on the landscape for particular forest types, and they're all going to change. So we need to start thinking more about our management in a climate smart framework. So we are working with Gunnison, with the Grand Mesa Uncompahgre National Forest now to help develop smart seed mixes that include a wide range of species that may or may not survive there, but you're sort of taking a shotgun approach to getting seeds into restoration mixes so that something will be okay. And we're recommending more of a warm season grass kind of mix in places where you might have used a cool season grass mix because of what we're predicting. So
Now, something that you told me about before this talk that I want to make you talk about again is the pinyon pine. It's a beloved Colorado tree. And this is one of your slides showing that historically, this is the precipitation versus temperature climate for pinyon pine. And in the future, we're looking at a temperature increase like this that changes the range where pinyon pines will live. And you looked at different scenarios. So this is a hot and dry scenario versus a warm and wet scenario. And this shows where the pinyon pines will get lost versus where they'll become emergent. I imagine that when a whole forest type changes locations, that changes some other things. True or false?
Oh yeah, it changes everything. So this is kind of a mid-century model of where we think habitats that pinyon pines live in will exist on the landscape and won't exist. So the green shows you places where we have pinyon pines now and where we estimate we still will have appropriate habitats, an appropriate climate regime for pinyon pine in the mid-century time frame. But blue is emergent, so that's where we don't have pinyon pines now. But the climate will become appropriate for pinyon pines, looking at these different sort of ensembles of models here. And then the brown areas are places where it's going to get too hot and dry to have pinyon pines. And so in those places, if you're a land manager, trying to manage for pinyon pine in those places might be a losing battle. You want to manage such that you're helping the landscape transform. So you want to support transformation using kind of climate smart kind of management practices. It might be reasonable to try to manage for pinyon pine in those green areas. That's a logical thing to do. And in the blue areas, there's something there that's going to be going away. And it might be that if you're working on restoration or forest managing or whatever, you might want to be thinking about pinyon pine as something that could be there. And pinyon pines are such a keystone species for tons of wildlife, and so pinyon jay is one that we're really worried about, seeing what's going to happen with pinyon pine. The problem with pinyon pine is that they have to get very old before they reproduce. They don't start producing cones till they're 75 years old. And then they start doing that in these big masting events where periodically every few years there's a whole ton of pinyon pine cones. And this year was pretty spectacular in southeastern Colorado for pinyon pines. Right now they're having a bumper crop of those. So that's great for wildlife. But as this whole landscape of that ecosystem changes, the biota that go along with that are going to change too. And so we're expecting that the pinyon jays and the other obligates are going to have a tough time.
Why should people care?
Well, there's a lot of reasons to care. There's sort of the ethical reasons and scientific reasons for conserving all of our species. And this is a really rich ecosystem, and the pinyon pines are really culturally important for tribes. They're super important for wildlife. We live in Colorado because we love the mountains, we love the nature, we love having all this wildlife, and so that's imperiled.
100% all of that, and I think this is a room full of people who feel that fundamentally. You wouldn't show up to this if you didn't. I imagine there are some, more venal reasons to care, though. Just the idea that pinyon pines could start encroaching on farmlands, or could affect, the viability of rangelands, or as former pinyon forests dry out, that makes the land less usable for other resources, even for recreational uses. Does all of that travel with a pinyon forest?
Well, I think, the timescales at which that threat unfolds are not things, I think those aren't our problems as much as just the loss of what we have on the ground right now. Then that whole biology of the pinyon pine makes them really not a threat to anybody.
But I ask this because that's a long time scale on a tree that many of us already know and love. There's another species that you were showing me about though, that probably faces maybe some slightly more imminent concern. Are there any of those out there?
There are a lot, and I think another dimension to this that you touched on is the fact that we live short lives on Earth. These things vary across long time periods, and we see changes. The snapshot that we get in human life is a small part of what's really happening on the landscape, and these things have moved around all over the landscape forever. So, but now things are happening so fast with climate change that they're just not going to be able to move fast enough. Some of them probably, and so we have to make some really tough decisions as managers and conservationists. And this species is one that's worth thinking about in this context. It's an endangered species of penstemon called the pear-sheep penstemon. Its global range are those 6 purple dots out at Grand Junction, and it's always been. This is a naturally rare species. Its habitat is really rare, and it only lives at the very top of that cliff on the Green River Shale. It doesn't like all the other shale. And so when we study that plant, we rope up with harnesses and stuff because it's a rather nasty fall if you slip on the scree slopes. This one, you can go to the next one and we can look at what we did for the State Wildlife Action Plan. So Colorado is really cool because we're one of the states that now has plants in our State Wildlife Action Plan. They're called PGCNs, Plants of Greatest Conservation Need, and our state formally recognizes a list of about 120 of our very rarest endemic species in Colorado, part of that plant. So the Penstemon debilis, this pear-sheep penstemon, along with almost all the other plants on that list, comes out using a thing called the CCVI, the Climate Change Vulnerability Index, which is a tool that NatureServe developed, which is the organization that heritage programs belong to understand vulnerability. And so you were talking about that with the BLM Climate Vulnerability Assessment report that we wrote. And these plants are all included in that assessment as well. And so when you are a plant that exists on a postage stamp of habitat on the entire face of the earth, when the climate envelope that you live in moves 700 miles north of you, your options are pretty limited. So we don't know what's going to happen with these things.
There's some immediate repercussions.
Yeah, we don't know how to manage. We don't know how to move them. We don't know if we should move them. I mean, that's totally playing God. That's called assisted migration, and that's a massive ethical dilemma that humans have to face now.
I have a question. As the habitat for different plants change and trees move or are unable to move and land dries up, what kind of implications does that have for things like fire corridors or where we expect to see natural disasters and how we plan to prepare?
That's an awesome question. I bet these folks can say more about that than me, but I will say a little bit because we're working on that. We're working on that now with some folks in Chaffee County who are being really progressive and putting together a comprehensive sort of vision for how to manage natural resources in Chaffee County. And they're thinking about wetlands and the role that they play on the landscape in slowing down fire because there's not trees in a lot of these wetlands. And so they might play an important role that we haven't really been thinking about that much as barriers to fire, natural fire breaks and barriers to fire. You had more nuances to your question that I don't remember.
Yeah, Katie, you probably have something to say about like shifting fire corridors.
That's not,
Not so much.
Well,
but Andrew
you know,
might.
So I think
I
one of the
appreciate the
things-
question, Mom, but no.
It's the,
I know where my expertise lies.
yeah, I think that you know, one of the things that these different forest types in a broad sense in Colorado have, each forest type is what they call a fire regime, right? Which is the historical intensity and interval which fire would occur. And as we, you know, change through modern logging practices, Westerners coming in and changing cultural practices of how we introduce fire, we've changed that. And so in mixing up that interval of fire, you know, and some of our front range communities, our lower montane is now, has more fuel than maybe it did historically 100 years ago, and that changes, especially when we have increased temperature. And when we're seeing increased temperature in some of our, you know, subalpine type forests, which generally didn't have as many hot days, and so there was moisture on the forest floor, and that's what carries a fire and the fuel. This all changes, and as we lose some of these trees to heat events too, or drought, there may become heat islands, and we're having these hotter fires too that don't allow for the sterilizing soils, so don't allow for seed beds to recover as quickly, long-term impacts. And so there is a cycle related to the fire and how we've seen it shift in our traditional thoughts of fire and how that burns and how it affects the landscape and our ability to plant. I can just use one anecdotal. I live in the 4 Mile Burn area, which was 2010 fire, 165 homes lost. I have planted close to 1,000 trees over the last 6 years, and I maybe have a handful of trees that have survived. And it is, and those are seedlings from CSU, and I just cannot get trees to grow, and even in wet years. And so it's just a different environment. It's so hot there. There's not the existing shade in the area on my lot to provide protection for those to actually take off in that period of time. And these are, you know, seedlings that come from the Pike San, the Arapaho Roosevelt that are native to where I'm at, and even junipers, Rocky Mountain junipers that are native to the area from seed banks. But it really has become a struggle to get anything to take. So.
One other thing that Boulder County has done to help adapt to the wildfire risk in the county and increase is we have a wildfire partners program where county staff will come and evaluate your home for wildfire risk and give you a mitigation plan so that you know where the tree brush is coming too close to your house, and you'll know where you can create the defensible space, because we do know that people are going to continue to live in the mountains, and we know that the mountains are going to continue to be a higher risk. And some insurance companies have even partnered with our wildfire partners program. And if you get they give you the evaluation, and then you have to do the work on your own. But if you become certified, there's some insurance companies that are starting to lower rates, or some insurance companies won't even insure in our mountain communities. So this is a way that we're trying to help our residents be safer, because some firefighters are not going to be able to get to them, and then also get the insurance that they need for their mortgage payments.
I have a question not on forest, but on open space. I live in Louisville. You skipped over Louisville and went to Lafayette.
Yeah, sorry.
We have a problem. We used to be a tree city, but a lot of those trees that we planted were ash trees, and the emerald ash borer has just destroyed them. So I'm on the city council there, and we're looking at a mitigation program. We're also looking at what do we replace those trees with? What do we do with the open space around the city? Because we have a lot of open space. So how do we get the natural species to come back without using sprays and insecticides and all these things that we don't want to use on our open space?
Yeah, I like the idea of just trying a bunch of different kind of trees, see what works. Because we don't know, I don't think there's one prescription for what the solution there is.
But actually, many cities have city foresters.
Mhm.
I live in Golden, and I called him up, and he said, "Oh, I'll come out to where you live and give you specific advice what to plant and what not to plant." Yeah. And they work with the CSU extension program.
Yeah, those are the people I would go to ask that question.
I would say too that, there is, one of the things we miss, and we see this with losing these trees, is actually having investment in some of these urban trees and identifying them as sort of critical infrastructure and pieces and parts of our community. Because when we lose, like the emerald ash, or the ash trees to the emerald ash borer, in Durango, the pinyon pine to the Ips beetle a few years ago was just incredible in wiping this out in areas. And so how do we actually re-look at some of our open space and parks as assets? It's really one of the, I think, unique things here in Colorado, and this would be up and down the Front Range, but it was something in Boulder County during when there's a federally declared disaster. There are different categories you can ask for reimbursement. In the 2013 flood, Boulder County actually blew all the records for the amount they asked for reimbursement for natural resources, because they include their parks, their open space, those sort of cultural things. And some communities, when they have these disasters, don't think about that as an asset. Because we've made investments in our parks and open space, we were able to utilize that and get huge federal funding for reimbursement, rebuilding the trails, because it's part of our resilience. The health of the community is our open space in Boulder County.
Well, and to build on that, when I was reading the Boulder County assessment after the flood, they found that those bike paths and running paths insulated other infrastructure from damage. Where those bike paths were located, it preserved other expensive infrastructure.
Yeah.
The bike paths, we were talking about this earlier, but the city of Boulder, which is where Boulder Creek runs through, was more insulated from the flood than a lot of other communities. And part of it was because of conscious flood planning on their part with the bike paths along the creek corridor, especially in the densest areas of the city. And that's where the overflow went, and that's, basements got flooded, but within the city of Boulder, the damage was so much less than in the city of Lyons, which lays at the base of a stream corridor as well. So that pre-planning really was critical.
I'm going to ask one more question, and if you people have questions, just put your hand up so we can make sure to get them. Otherwise, we'll break for food and drinks. Food's back there, drinks are over there. And Isabel is going to talk briefly about a toolkit that the Alliance Center is building. So my last question for this panel is, there's so much good energy that Boulder has put into resiliency and mitigation and adaptation, into building along waterways so that they're more flood resistant, into being prepared. And there's a study that came out recently about Boston trying to do the same thing, rehabilitating some of its coastal areas, safeguarding against flooding. But the social ramifications of that were incredibly negative, it turned out. Those had previously been low-income neighborhoods, and the investments in infrastructure and in parks increased the property values and pushed local people out. And not only did it push them out of the places they were, it pushed them to marginalized area in low-quality buildings affected by adverse health and climate conditions, and it dislocated their children from education and stability. Is there a model that you've seen that's building in human resilience to climate mitigation, or is this something we all just need to become a lot more conscious of?
So in Boulder County, our current conversations about equity are really about racial equity and acknowledging that there are racial equity differences first, primarily before there are equity differences in other disadvantaged populations. And when we look at that and look at the communities that are most impacted by disasters in the county, those are primarily communities of color. And we didn't do a good job post-flood, but we are doing a better job now through the cultural broker programming that Andrew talked about, and through really realizing that that's an issue, really realizing that there's an issue of racial equity as much as other equities, and focusing on the racial equity first. And in doing that, we do a lot of listening sessions with those communities about whatever they need to talk to the government about, whether it's not our agenda or not. So we do cultural broker listening sessions, which were originally aimed at creating more prepared Spanish-speaking populations. Those listening sessions had nothing to do with preparedness. They had nothing to do with getting a kit, making an evacuation plan. They had to do with listening, getting that community connected, and then building trust. And then sometimes we talk about preparedness, and sometimes we just lead those communities through listening conversations. So I think for government to do it right, there has to be conversations with those communities that maybe aren't about the topic the government wants to talk to them about.
And one cool thing about that I learned in my reading yesterday, becoming an expert on this topic, was that in those listening sessions, it came out that your lower income communities of color wanted to continue line drying their clothing, which is both more climate friendly and cheaper for them and more culturally appropriate. And they had been banned from doing it, but these listening sessions brought out the practice and changed the City of Boulder's climate mitigation action plan. So everybody wins.
Yeah, I mean, we did this post-flood too with a lot of, just all the communities that were impacted. We had listening sessions in those communities, not targeted like with racial equity in mind, but just go to listening sessions about the community, asking about where the information they were missing, with no agenda on our part except to be a cultural broker back to local government. So I serve as a cultural broker back to my elected official's office and can network that chain of county government that's a logistical nightmare if you're a resident of the county.
But just add one thing to that, is that in sort of this change, and again, it was out of 2013 that I think we had, and these other incidents, at least in my world, disasters, that, you know, we recognize some of those gaps is in new plans and writing a strategy that, you know, the acknowledgement of social vulnerabilities and social, cultural, and economical impacts to different communities is different, has to be at the center of that, looking at that sort of acknowledgement that there are limitations to resources and information sharing. And so by sort of acknowledging that up front is a first sort of attempt of, okay, let's look at this, you talked about earlier, of what is this resilience lens, and you're thinking infrastructure, it's robust and redundant and all these different factors, but looking at our different programs with this resilience lens and evaluating it, you know, based on where it fits there.
I'd like to thank our panelists, David, Andrew, and Katie. I think you guys have been really great. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to thank the Alliance Center for hosting us, and the Truman Center for Policy for support of Operation Free, and Julia for being here. And I'd like to introduce Isabel, who's going to come up from the Alliance Center to talk about a climate plus national security toolkit, I think.
Yes.
And thank you all for being a wonderful audience.
Well, good evening, everybody. Again, my name is Isabel Mendoza, and I'm the program manager here at the Alliance Center. And I just want to show you something really cool. I'm a GIS specialist, among other things, and really a map nerd. I know that you saw some really cool maps. But the thing is, thank you to Truman National Security Project that partnered with us with creating this educational tool. And the idea is to have research and data-based educational tools where you can actually interact with the data and have more understanding of the issues that we face in our state. I just want to be very clear that this toolkit is still on a beta version. So we're going to send you the link by tonight or tomorrow morning so you can actually open it and see it. And I would appreciate if you guys at the very bottom of the page, there is a little button that you can click on and you can just add your feedback, your ideas. It is important to us to know what you would like to learn more, what wasn't clear. So basically you can scroll down and there is a bunch of links with that actually go to the sources where all this information was gathered from. And sorry, and you can also interact with the maps as well. You can click here and choose the different layers. And the idea is that we want to provide as much knowledge as possible, and that you can really see, like overlay the different map layers and see how really things kind of go together. You know, we, for example, have like a drought layer, and we have a layer with many of the military bases in the state. And once you read through the text, give a little bit more context. So I will send you that, and I hope you enjoy it. And please let me know if you have any comments.
I think it's great you have all those watersheds on there, because I don't care about 14ers, but the waters.
I think those are flood zones actually. So it's interesting, you know, when we talk about, you know, flooding, and you know, we have a lot of bases in Colorado, and you know how that interact with everything that you already heard. So I wanna add more to it, but at the bottom where it says Toolkit Feedback Survey, that's where you add all your comments. So thank you very much, and thank you. We're very happy to have you here at our home at the Lion Center building. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well. Thank you, Lion Center, and thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you guys, and we've got some food and drinks, and we hope to see you again. If you didn't on your way in, if you could please just register that you are here on the sign-in sheet, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.